Good morning, everyone, and welcome for this panel discussion today, brought to you by Blockwall in the frame of the Impact Week. The title for today is Distributed Ledger Technologies in the New Decade for Data Privacy and Sovereignty. So we have a great lineup of investors today, and that will share their vision for the future. But before we get into it, I have a few information for you. First, the webinar will be recorded, and of course, you will have access to the recorded version only if you are registered. So that's a good news. This is a more private information. During the webinar, you will have the possibility to ask your questions. So I will be the moderator, and I will manage the questions for you. After the webinar, if we don't have time to answer to all the questions, we'll try to reply to you directly. So if you want to engage your community, feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter or LinkedIn with the hashtag ImpactWeek20, and we will be more than happy to share your thoughts to our community, and that will be more visibility for you. So before we get into it again, I'm going to start a poll in order to know a little bit more about the audience itself. Today we have a fully packed room, so we would like to know a little bit better about you. So let's start the first poll. We would like to know what type of organization you are. So if you are a large company, mid-cap, SME, startup, or a cluster, an association, or research organization. So again, I was saying that we had lots of registrations today, almost 100 people registered to the event, and I can see the Georg is still rising. So we have an audience which is composed of 80% of startups, which is not very surprising, a few mid-caps, which is also interesting. It gives you a little bit more time to answer, and I will close the poll. Thank you very much for sharing who you are, and let's get into it. I'm Regis Samlin, I'm the CTO of Blockwall. I will be the moderator for today, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to our panel today. So first, I would like you to maybe introduce yourself, explain what is your role into your organization, and most of you are investors. You are working for venture capital firms. So if you can explain a little bit about your investment strategy during your introduction. So maybe Georg, you can start. You are tech lead and principal at Signature Venture.
Exactly. Thanks, Regis, for being here. I'm very happy. Go usually by the name of Yuri, so that's the one in the brackets. It's just a complication with my name usually because of two citizenships. Anyway, so I'm working as a tech lead and principal for Signature Ventures, and Signature Ventures is a network and research-driven VC fund with a focus on equity investments in early-stage blockchain and DLT startups across Europe. So we do also invest globally, but we do focus on Europe. We can also token investments if necessary, but this is kept to a minimum. Usually we do mostly equity investments.
Okay, very good. And we'll have later today a dedicated session where you are going to introduce us to Signature Venture. So exactly. For whoever wants more information, you have to register for this afternoon session. So Dominic Briggs, you are general partner at Blockwall. Good morning, Dominic.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm a general partner at Blockwall. We are a venture capital platform. We have one fund active in the market already since 2018, focused solely on token investments in centralized networks. And we're have a second fund now where we invest only in equity companies. So in these revenue-driven business models, which actually use and apply blockchain technology. We're focused on early stage, so pre-seed to Series A investments, preferably also Europe, and driving innovation in Europe, but also opportunistically on a global space.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Boulder, you are a Chief Investment Officer for Maven 11. So you are not located in Germany, you are located in Amsterdam. So good morning, Boulder.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And indeed, luckily enough, I'm located in Amsterdam and not in Germany, right? Yeah, we're founded in 2016, and Maven 11 Capital been investing since. We are focused, as also the two other venture capital firms, on token investment, but also on equity investments, mainly focused on the pre-seed to seed phase of early stage companies. And our main focus is these days financial infrastructure and layer 1 and layer 2 technologies, decentralized networks in that sense.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker of the panel today, Tom Trowbridge. So you're not really an investor, you have been, but you are still. Today, we introduce you as a co-founder of Fluence Labs. So maybe you can give us a little bit more about your background and what is exactly Fluence Labs for the audience today.
Yeah, sure, happy to. Thanks for having me. Before Fluence, I'll just spend a minute. I helped found a company called Hedera Hashgraph, which is a base layer consensus algorithm. And you know, it's been a successful enterprise so far. I left that about a year ago, but of note, Blockwall was one of our investors in that. And so thank you, Dominic. Obviously, I know Lorenz well and appreciate your guys' support and all of that. I didn't get Balder in that yet, but who knows? We'll see. Got another bite at the apple coming up, and likewise. So for Signature Ventures, but I basically found Hedera by way of investment, and so I invested in a company called Swirls, which was the parent company of Hedera, and then Manson Lehman asked me to come on board and basically launch and help found and build out the public ledger, which was Hedera. I've left. I've now co-founded a company called Fluence Labs. And Fluence Labs is developing and has developed a distributed peer-to-peer computing platform. And the main use of this platform initially is a reward system, a blockchain-enabled reward system for open source software. So it allows open source software users to pay and open source authors to actually be compensated for their work. And that, I think, has been open source's enormous market, but there's been no way for authors to be directly compensated besides one-off grants and donations. And we're trying to solve that problem, and I'm excited to do so.
Yeah, very interesting. We will come back to open source at the end of this discussion. So I'm expecting you to give us your vision on that. And luckily for you, you have maybe your lineup of investors for your next venture. Okay, so thank you very much for this introduction. So let's get into the first topic. In fact, blockchain has been in the hype for the last few years. It was all about blockchain. A few years ago, we could see blockchain events everywhere, new blockchain companies everywhere, ICOs, and maybe the hype is not so strong today. So maybe what we would like to discuss now is what do you see as the next step for blockchain? What are the next applications that we could expect from these technologies? And maybe what are the lessons learned from the few years that we went through? So maybe Georg, you can start sharing your thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure. So we usually look at blockchain technology kind of through the lens of 3 layers in a way. That there is a requirement for a fundamental layer where usually you have this first and base layers and second layer solutions, and there's a kind of second layer of innovation, which is kind of the interface that interacts with this fundamental one. And then there is the application layer that actually uses the blockchain through the interfaces, where the user doesn't actually know anything about blockchain anymore, so he doesn't even know that he uses it, right? And we see kind of these layers developing through feedback loops. So one progression and innovation in one layer enables the next layer to go forward, and that happens like successive. And the important case is to know where we're standing at the moment. I mean, if you look now at the news, you mostly will see a lot of DeFi happening on Ethereum, but that even seems to be developing in sort of also kind of bubbly way, almost like ICO-ish way, to a certain degree, in our opinion at least. So we currently see a really good stuff happening on the application part, mostly also in the regulatory sector and enterprise sector, where slowly some applications are coming out that are including solutions for enterprise. They're very basic yet, but they are coming. And we already see also this feedback loop going back to the protocols and the base layers that they're developing further in the need for the applications.
Okay, very good. And at Signature Venture, do you invest into one particular layer? Is there one particular layer which is in the core of your strategy?
We have 3 pillars, and which every pillar is corresponding to actually the same layer, to the specific layer. That's how we know it. We have defined some subcategories, obviously, for each pillar for the layers that we invest in. For example, you have I said base layers or pure protocols, or privacy or scalability enhancing layers on the infrastructure side, also development tools. You have something like wallets, exchanges, custodian solutions on the interfaces, and you have all kinds of applications which are mostly at the moment we see in the identity and in the gaming part on the application side, because gaming guys just know about digital assets, and decentralized identity is just very crucial. It's just the very first thing you have to solve if you build anything on blockchain.
Ah, interesting. I was not expecting gaming to be part of. We don't see gaming so often to this community. So, Dominic, what about you? What do you think? Do you share this vision of these 3 layers, and what is your own vision?
Yeah, I mean, 3 layers captured it. Of course, it's very diverse and detailed, but this is probably the best way to describe it in a high-level view. In general, if you compare the internet as we know it, it was more a UI UX revolution, and blockchain is more about being a back-end revolution, and that directly points to B2B business models. And we are at a phase where the technology was developed bottom up, and it's reaching the point where it meets the feedback of market needs, so the real corporates wanting to use it. And the experience when looking at startups in that space, what many of them don't realize in the beginning is that these corporates have like very long sales cycles. It sometimes takes 18 to 24 months until they go into production and really use it. So that's also sometimes it's so quiet around the entire adoption space in blockchain because companies are still testing it, and these testing cycles are very long. And in terms of and we have to get from talking about use cases at some point to talking about real business cases, and that's sometimes difficult because these use cases being tested, they are the data silos for themselves. You often don't get the feedback on what is the real effect of blockchain use cases, talking about cost improvements or efficiencies. And if we come to the other questions of the layers, where do we invest in? We invest in both, so in decentralized networks and in equity. And we see that there are business cases on all layers. However, we see that there are certain financing mechanisms which work particularly well on one layer and not on the other. So, for example, on decentralized networks, we see tokens as a viable option because you have mainly no other choice. And the critical part is that the value has to be captured in that token. So designing token economics is extremely difficult and probably one of the key success factors of setting up a successful company in that space. And if you talk about services supporting the ecosystem or applications being built and using blockchain, there we don't necessarily see the need of tokens in that business model, at least not freely tradable ones.
Okay, thank you very much. I can see already questions popping up into from the audience. We'll take those questions a little bit later because it's dedicated to open source. So, Border, your turn. What about your use case or applications of DLC or blockchain for the next few years?
Yeah, I think a couple of good points were raised so far already. Back to your question, right? What's the status today, and what kind of emerging applications are we seeing? It's good that the hype died off, and I think we've got the time in our industry to work on very important issues like scalability, solving privacy, UI, UX, like you said, that's definitely important for onboarding mainstream users, and also allowing them to use an application without them knowing that the underlying technology is going to be blockchain or crypto. I think he touched upon DeFi, which I do. It's definitely very, very overheated right now. So we have just had the launch of a couple of DeFi applications out there, protocols actually, which are doing extremely well, very highly priced. But I think the underlying trend is extremely strong. This is one of these use cases of blockchain or DLT usage, which will probably be there for decades to come. It's very early stage still, but I think the fact that you're going to be able to economically interact with each other without an intermediary is what this technology is made for, and is extremely powerful. So we are definitely looking forward to what's to come in the DeFi space. Yeah, and on the corporate side, I think I agree with Dominic there, is that what we're seeing is that these sales cycles do take long, and they take a sort of conservative and defensive approach. Also, as our industry as a whole is not very regulated, so I fully understand that they are careful in where to put the money. But overall, I think slowly and surely we are seeing more corporates getting into the industry and starting to build stuff.
Okay, very good. We have an interesting comment from the audience that said they agree that tokens are viable because they have no other choice. This is one comment for Dominic, so someone applauds to this comment. So Tom, what would you like to share with us about your vision on the next step for DLT?
You know, I guess what I say is that scalability will drive use more than use drives scalability. And so what I think we've seen at Hedera, just as an example, is that you know has a scalability is orders of magnitude more than any other live network. And so you're seeing use cases develop there that just aren't possible, not even contemplated in other base layers. And so just an example I'd like to talk about there, just to get people thinking about ways in which this technology can be used, is coupons. And so there's the Coupon Bureau in the United States, and that is basically an organization that is manages coupon issuance and redemption for dozens of companies that account for about 350 billion coupons a year. And using a scalable DLT, they can eliminate fraud. And fraud there is estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars a year in coupons. And so if you can put those on a cheap, scalable, consensus algorithm based layer, you can save hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud. Now that, you're talking about hundreds of billions of transactions a year, right? You're talking about 6,000 to 7,000 TPS. That is not possible before. And so once you have a real scalability that's functioning, use cases start to become apparent. And I think that's what I think people sort of have to realize, is that in the current state, you can't look at where we are right now and say, this is, what works on this. You have to sort of think further ahead. And I mean, the way an analogy is to look at you couldn't have predicted when you were holding, an early Nokia phone, you couldn't have predicted Uber and Airbnb, etc., because you didn't have the processing power, you didn't have the bandwidth, you didn't have the maps. And so you needed those things to happen, that advancement, in order for the creativity to be unleashed and for it to become really usable to a whole nother level. And so I think that's what we're going to see with deployed, effective, scalable, layer one solutions.
Okay, Georg, I see you nodding. Do you want to comment on this issue of scalability? Do we have a problem of scalability in DLT?
I'm nodding basically because there is a distinction between this first layer thing, where what you call protocols, and the rest of things that you usually see through blockchain, right? The kind of stuff building on Ethereum, for example, are more application-ish than actual protocols, right? And in protocols, what you usually had, you didn't have this kind of market competition. You actually had more of a scientific competition, right? Where you converge pretty fast to what is the good one to use for. And a protocol can do one thing and one thing only. I think that's where I agree with Tom, that scalability is a really crucial thing there. And a sort of market competition is happening right now between Ethereum and Ethereum killers and all the kind of different ones, where there's money involved. it's I don't know, it's kind of strange. It just feels stranger to me than the usual way protocols used to converge to use case.
Well, except the only thing I'd say is that there always has been competition between protocols. You know, HTTP wasn't deemed the protocol. There was a real debate about what would actually serve as the standards for communication online. That there always is, and there were multiple competing ones, especially in Europe. And so I think it just have to go back a little bit further to see that competition happen. And the other thing I would say is that we take for granted many of the big businesses around us right now. But when Google started in 1994, and that was a very mature market with Yahoo having 2/3 of it, right? And where's Yahoo now? And you could go down the list. Amazon, actually it was Amazon 94. Others, with Amazon with Barnes and Noble was enormous, right? So a lot of the companies we take for granted today started in competitive, crowded spaces, and then ultimately dominated because of their success. I don't think that's that different with the protocol layer.
No, I mean the difference I wanted to make is that usually on protocols, as you said, there was debate, right? There was a kind of more scientific way of competition. I would call that. Right? People debating what's the best, how to best deal with it, right? And then we now have actually money in the protocols, and that gives us a free market-ish competition, which is different from that. And I'd say that events the convergence that you usually see in a scientific debate towards the best kind of protocol.
Yeah, I mean, I take it even further. That I'll agree with you even more strongly, which is that because there's so little use happening, it ends up being almost more of a technical debate, as you said, or even a religion to some extent, because people want to believe certain things, and there's very little data to rest on to contradict one position versus another. So yeah, I agree with that.
Dominic, the comments you did on tokens raised another question. In fact, you said your token is a very complex business model to design. Designing token is complex, and the question is about what kind of model can you see working? What is a good model for tokens?
I think there's no broad answer to that. So if you talk about protocols, right, you have a certain stakeholders involved which have certain interests. If you take the Bitcoin network, for example, it's clearly designed in such a way that that the token itself captures all value, because there's no other way. But if you have an application being built on Ethereum, issuing their own token and having a parallel equity case next to it, from an investor's point of view, you always ask, okay, where is it captured? Is it in the equity? Is it the token? What is the sense of the token itself? So, for example, if you take what Tom is developing at the moment, if you have a token which incentivizes and gives monetary value to developers of open source technology, there is an intrinsic value in that itself. And it's not only about the way you design the token, but also how you issue it. So there is liquidity topics. For example, Hedera, they chose a method where they have very, very low liquidity in the beginning, only having a part of the tokens available to the market. So protecting kind of the value and slowly growing network, whereas there are others which have far more supply in the market where the danger of volatility and that it goes down is at risk. So for me, it's always about what market are you addressing and what features do you want to cover in that token. But if you think about just using the technology itself, I don't see why you don't go for a traditional financing round in equity. And by the way, I'm not talking about the potential of financing yourself via security tokens in future. But as an investor, you want to have certain control rights, governance rights, if you invest into a startup. And that, in the most cases, is not given for an application.
Thank you, Dominic. So I think that we're going to move to the next topic, which is about data privacy and data sovereignty. So we have seen a number of data breach issues in the past. So we won't come back on that, but it led also to some reaction at the European level, because we have now the GDPR in Europe. Data privacy and data sovereignty, let's say, it's a value that we cherish and that we want we want some kind of good behavior with this regard. So the answer of Europe has been regulation. So what do you think that blockchain and DLT can bring something to this problem? And so Yuri, maybe you can start to share your views on that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as Dominic said in the very beginning, that the blockchain is kind of a back-end revolution, and I think that's when you come from the regulation side, and you can actually implement it into this back-end, then it might help very well. What I'm not sure of is that Europe is capable of providing that sort of environment where this is possible, for startups at least. That's something because when I see European projects, like for example the Gaia X project, now they're coming from above, basically telling people now we have to do this specifications and this digital infrastructure to be European. I'm not sure this actually will work to provide the tools to do that in the end. They provide a great maybe framework of the GDPR, but I'm not really sure in Europe that they are providing a good environment to build the tools for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Dominic, you.
Yeah, I think GDPR was an answer to a bigger problem, which wasn't changeable in any other way because technology was not at hand, but blockchain definitely is a solution to that. And we are talking within something called the Impact Week. And so data privacy and data sovereignty is the backbone of society and the economy, right? So it's if you don't have identity, you don't have access to land rights, to financial systems, to being educated, to schools. And I remember a study from the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation who said that if you don't have identity, you don't have access to bank accounts, you can't develop a kind of savings philosophy to take part in financial systems. So I think that DLT at a ground layer can help change that role and help create identity for those who are without identity, and that's I think 1.1 billion people without identity at the moment, but most of them have a phone, right? So you can manage credentials and claims with that. And if you talk about identity too, I think it's important to distinguish kind of private identity where there's a possibility and identity for things, right? And if you already split those, then you already get more privacy automatically for the identity. And to sum it up, kind of, it's not about regulation so much, but also about more efficiency and making life easier. If you have a pooled identity and can manage your identity and you are the owner of your data and identity, you can onboard quicker, you can get rid of all these paper processes which are still active today. I see a lot of impact blockchain can enable for data privacy and data sovereignty.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very, very important. Two things that I can, the identity of things and the efficiency into our daily life. Boulder, what do you think about the role of blockchain and data sovereignty? Oh, we can't hear you. We lost you. It seems that we have audio issues. No, it's still not working. Maybe you can dial in from the telephone number. So while you're trying to fix this issue, maybe Tom, you can jump in the conversation and share your thoughts, maybe with a different angle.
Sure. I mean, I think this is a huge topic. And so first, agreeing with Dominique's perspective, I mean, self-sovereign identity is a critical thing that will make life easier for all of us. And I think the market will deliver that to us. It's just a question of when and how. I think consumers don't necessarily know they want it, but once they have it, they will very much appreciate it because they won't have to deal with 50 different passwords in, and keys and, smart identifiers and, all these, two-factor authentication, etc. It will make life a lot easier. So I think consumers will really adopt it when it gets there, even though they're not clamoring for it at the moment. But the risk is also here that in an effort to protect consumers, overzealous regulation leads to significant unintended consequences. And so a lot of the GDPR regulation has obviously favored the large enterprises that have the resources to orient themselves and to build solutions that are GDPR compliant, which makes life, which the normal startup may not have and usually doesn't have. And so those regulations, while clearly well-intentioned and designed to protect consumers, slow down in many cases the ecosystem that can generate growth. It's not an intentional thing, but you need to have businesses who have an incentive to create these types of answers and solutions. And once the big ones have actually already are compliant with the regulation and have devoted resources to it, they're not going to have much of an interest in innovating. And you then raise the bar for smaller ones to innovate and to provide the solutions that actually solve the problem that the regulation is intended to address. And so that's a sort of typically American perspective about regulation versus European. So have to say that, and I think there's real truth to it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's very interesting. So even though we have two visions, Europe and US, you are kind of converging, saying that at the end GDPR is not making the business; it's more the usability and the ease of use. How this technology makes our life easier, that will generate the business, not the regulation. And your feeling, Tom, is that regulation will make life more difficult for the startups. Border. Yeah, you want to comment on it?
Just one thing to add. I think Tom raised a very good point, is that it's on the basis of this over-regulation also, it opens up a complete new universe of business models and possibilities, trying to solve this problem on another way, which again funnels innovation and possibilities for investors to invest in. So that's why I think it's a very good point to raise, that you can solve it with technology too.
Okay, so Border, are you back? I see you have your...
I think I'm hearing you.
Yeah.
You're hearing me all right. Perfect.
So let's share your thoughts, please. Go ahead. What's your vision with regard to DLT?
I missed Tom's comment, and I think the last thing is around what Dominic just said, the opening up of new businesses around SSI and sovereign identity. One of these use cases, obviously, is that how GDPR currently is structured and how we're interacting with any company or website is that we give them a lot of data. That the protection and the security of the data is actually a huge issue for these companies and these corporates, right? Because they have this GDPR and regulation behind them. So I think the SSI here and our solutions around identity will definitely solve this for corporates, and it opens up new businesses. So I think that's a good point.
And we have a question from the audience, which is specifically on the opening of new business. It's related to the Article 20 of GDPR. We have an audience which is very savvy in the GDPR. So do you see space for DLT-based solution in the area around portability of personal data? So who wants to share something? Yuri?
I mean, I can just start, right, throwing some stuff. I've been talking to some people who are developing decentralized identity protocols, already on the protocol level, and they said the problem is that there is so much fragmentation and so many different nationalities, or like nations or cultures, or you have industries. They have all different specifications, and you can't really build, like on a very fundamental level, you can't really build for all of them. It's very much impossible because there's so much fragmentation. And I think that's one of the problems, especially specifically in Europe, that they're not consistent and standardized yet so far that you can really address a market with your startup or whatever you have an idea easily. It will be always too small because it's too fragmented.
Okay, very good. So it leads us maybe to the last section of this webinar, which is about open source. So we already scratched the surface of open source with Tom at the beginning. So we will start first with investors. Open source sometimes is not so attractive to investors because there's an issue with the IP. And that's not how open source is working. This is not the fundamental of open source. Open source is about sharing and it's about community. So how do you see open source concepts? Do you invest in open source projects? Boulder, maybe you could start on that.
Yeah, so there's definitely a big change going on. I think Tom can elaborate further on the movement from IP-based software to open source based. The best example actually we have gotten like 30 days ago in our industry. There's one protocol that I've been building for 2.5 years. It's completely open source now. So it's obviously when it's open source, you're able to copy the code and you're able to implement the code yourself and build a company around it. So there was a company who did this and they ended up losing some customer funds as the code was not as secure as they thought. So you see immediately the pitfalls of the fact that something is open source doesn't mean you're going to be able to copy the code and use it for yourself or build a business around it. And the second thing that comes with it, if you open source, I think the fact that you're building a business on your own open source software is that the network effect that comes with it if you build it in the right way, e.g., for instance, with a token model, is extremely strong. So I think if you go back to the crypto economics as we have discussed just now earlier, and you design that well and for the right system, then I think the network effects that derive from that will be extremely strong for protecting your open source solution in this case.
Okay. So for you, there's a direct link between token model and open source business.
It's not a one-on-one correlation, but I think the token model, as we discussed earlier, is more coming down to in which layer are you investing and what kind of solution are you building. But we also see open source software being used, for instance, from equity standpoint of an equity company. So it's not a token per se. I just meant more that I think that the crypto economics around the token are very important in creating that network effect. And I think the network effect in that sense sort of protects the open source software, right? Because it makes it a little bit proprietary in that instance.
Okay, so the network effects protect the open source software. Dominic, Yuri, you want to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think generally open source, of course, has pros and cons, but a major pro is that you decrease development costs massively. So you have a kind of co-innovation, co-development atmosphere, creating a community around a great project. And even if some developers or part of the team drops out, it can be taken back up and continuously developed. So that is a huge advantage that you are able to develop new systems in a broader way, and also most of the time securer if you have the possibility of testing it on several ways. And you don't really rely on one provider. So that is a real advantage, and you can manage and build token economics around that. But what is important, open source doesn't mean that it has to be a project or a company has to use open source in all their business aspects. So you can choose for some aspects using open source technology, and for some others you don't have to. So if you want to protect a certain environment. And also in terms of competition, it's a lot about competitive dynamics. If you talk about kind of resource similarity, so where's an overlap, what market do you address? We talked about scalability before. In the end, the way you build it ends up how you address and capture market share quicker. And open source is definitely a possibility to get market share quicker. And I have an example also where we looked at actually an identity protocol. and there was one being more the leader and creating a real detailed and high-level open source protocol, and another trying to copy it. And the one copying it still didn't succeed securing investors and getting market share, because the others has built a community around it, has great partnerships, and a go-to-market strategy which worked. So open source doesn't mean that you're not competitive or can defend your competitive edge.
Yeah.
Okay.
I maybe like to add to that, I mean, in the end, open source is not necessarily, it's not a business model, it's a development model. Yeah. It fosters the community and it allows you to have many eyes on the code, right? To see any bugs, potential bugs and problems. But the business model around open source, I mean, Red Hat pretty much showed it very well, that you can have services offering around a certain open source code, and because you're a main contributor, for example, you might be the best person to know it well, and so you might actually offer valuable services, and that's where you get the business model from.
Yeah, and maybe also to add to that, Yuri, is that you enable a market standard very quickly. So even big corporates like Azure, Microsoft, they also do open source code development, right, to get input from all stakeholders. So it's a very collaborative way of working and bringing a product out there which actually addresses the need of the market.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the standardization being a very important point indeed. I think that's very important to move forward there.
There's a lot of different pieces to hit on this, and I'm spending a lot of time on it. I would just, I'll start by saying, for anyone interested in understanding the challenges of open source, the Ford Foundation wrote a terrific report in 2016 that you could, if you Google Ford Foundation, open source challenges, I think it's something along those lines. It's a 143-page report detailing all of the challenges in open source. And so first, to agree with, the huge amount of companies run on open source, and to agree with Dominic and Balder in particular, but also Yuri, the competitive edge of open source is not patents. It's actually building a community and an ecosystem of users. And that's where open source kind of overlaps particularly well with blockchain, because in blockchain enabled communities, there's value then that can accrue to the ecosystem, which is driven by the token. And so that has worked relatively well in blockchain. And if you look just at Bitcoin as an example, Bitcoin has been copied, 50 times, 60 times, and it has had no impact really that we can tell on the price of Bitcoin. And so I think if you're curious about value capture in open source, that is your poster child example of you can copy it 1,000 times, it doesn't change and you have the exact same code, it doesn't matter. And so that's sort of one point to put there. But what I would challenge a little bit is the open source business model with relation to other less blockchain, non-blockchain related projects gets more challenged. And if you take Red Hat as an example, or there's another kind of 15, 20 of them, the business models break down into either a consulting type model where you're building custom implementations for enterprises, adding new features on, fine. That's sort of the open core concept. Or you have the model which is sort of a hosting, where you're hosting the software and selling kind of hosting services as well. And there's usually some combination of those two. Those are both fine, but they're very different than writing, the core code. And so you're forcing, in order to monetize this open source, you're forcing developers effectively to build complex companies that are operationally intensive and people heavy. And that's not generally the skill set of talented developers who write really great critical code. And so what we're trying to do is to have a model for those entrepreneurs who don't want to build those enterprises that are serving ancillary services and instead just want to try to monetize what they've built. And so I think we are, one person told me we're living in the golden age of open source monetization, and it may seem that way because of the dozen or so companies like Red Hat that have monetized it, but they are actually monetized kind of offshoots of it. And so I think there is an enormous, once you've ability to monetize this is further advanced, I think you'll see even more open source development around us than you currently do. Or just to give you a sense, I mean, there are 40 million open source developers in the world right now. just vast. And I think that number will only grow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the motivation of coders in open source is not to be demonstrated in the. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience now because we have a few. One is more of comments. Someone said that 99% of the time open source is scary for investors. So maybe we won't get into. So the question is, what should the community do from the point of view of these investors to change this opinion? I think you answered that question. This is not about community of open source, because there's kind of confusion between open source as a development model and business model. What you have to demonstrate is that your business, your company, is capable to build a community and to go to market fast. That's my understanding. Do you agree with my wrap-up of your various comments?
I think it's well said, Regis.
Yep.
Okay. So it's not about open source; it's about business model.
But one element I add to that is, if you're thinking about it from either investment or capital raising perspective, you have to be sure that the person doing it is going to be able to write the code, and either they have a partner or they're also then going to be the same person to operate the go-to-market in the business. Those are not always the same people, right? And so if you're an investor, you have to be sure that's going to happen. And if you're the actual entrepreneur, you have to be sure you're going to convince investors of both of those things.
Maybe to add a little bit nuance to open source generally. I mean, there are kind of, you can build code which is very open, but you don't have to open source everything about it. We have been talking to a company, for example, that open sourced a lot of it, but not basically the fundamental core sort of algorithm doing something AI stuff, right? It's like if you have a scientist who develops something new, they have a paper out, but just because you read the paper doesn't mean you can really literally build the same thing as the scientist did, because he left some stuff out, right? And there are still kind of potentially ways. I'm not saying there is always true. I'm just saying potentially ways that you can monetize that part.
I don't think Richard Stallman would be that happy about that.
I'm just coming from open source field. I'm basically coming from that side, and I have a different, maybe still a different opinion from the developer side. But if you're an investor, you want to see value somewhere.
Yep.
But it's a very fair point, and I think everybody here agrees that there's a secret sauce in your company, and you're not gonna give away your secret sauce. So definitely don't do that.
So I mean, also it's the backbone of the business model, but it's not the business model itself. So you also have to think about governance structures. How do you develop it further? Who's involved? I think, Tom, probably you can also talk a lot about how you build that for Hedera. But getting the right people involved in these business models to use it, to trust it, to be part of it is a huge topic also in designing these open networks.
I'll take another question from the audience. So the question we discussed here is, do you invest into open source? And the question is, do you invest in cooperatives, which is not a business model, but it's more a new organization, a new structure. So is it something that you have ever considered? Is it something that you have seen before?
I'm sorry, what's a cooperative?
Cooperatives.
Cooperatives.
Yeah. Like a bunch of people coming together, or
I think it's more structural. It's not a company, and to be honest, I'm not exactly sure of what is the legal structure of a cooperative. I'm trying to
maybe
it sounds a little bit like a DAO. So controlled by multiple people and independent, I would say.
Yeah, independent of what it is. I think it's still, no matter what model you choose or how you come together to build something, it still applies to general capital market rules. So you will have to have a business model. The investor will have to see, does the team fit to develop it? How are you organized? How do you process yourself? How do you go to market? Do you know what the market need is, and can you address it and sell the product? What is your pricing strategy? and we would never invest in something where we don't see the upside. Otherwise, this would be something on the side we can do as impact investing. But for a general VC to invest, you are promising certain multiples to your investors. So it trickles down to pretty much, can I achieve these multiples when investing in that business model? And is the scale quick enough, or is it something which takes longer? So that is the rationale, at least we put to everything we look at. Can they deliver? Can we control it in some certain way? And can we be part of the scaling process and have an exit route?
So just to conclude on the
at the same time, I fully agree, but I think we are moving away as a society from a more, let's say, shareholder-focused investing, right? What we've seen, especially in the first 2 decades, and I think this technology is allowing us to do it differently and also be more stakeholder-centric and stakeholder-aware as in launching the crypto networks, because it's not only about the investor, but I think to launch a decentralized network, you need so much more than investors. I think that realization is something that's very adamant in our industry.
If you talk about decentralized network, yes, but if you talk about the applications, the businesses using it as a backbone in tech and having corporates on the other side as their customers, for example, there you have to apply the same shareholder rules, right?
I mean, there is a whole debate about centralized networks. They're very young at the moment, right? But if you want to develop the network, you still become a sort of company that kind of builds around that network. It's in the ecosystem and builds an ecosystem, and you still need a company that monetizes something and has some sort of IP, because the token itself is not a business model, right? It will at some point should at least reach an equilibrium where it's not appreciating anymore that much and won't finance your company anymore. I mean, it might be 50 years down the road, but it will be happening at some point.
Oh, I want to dive in and disagree there. If you have a protocol that actually functions appropriately with the appropriate token economics, you don't need any equity value whatsoever. And if the founders have some share of those tokens, they have incentive for it to work. And if the ecosystem functions as intended, it should be self-funding over time. And that's a rare case, but it really can happen. Now, most business models, and we can throw a bunch of people under the bus, simply fund themselves by selling tokens, right? So we've seen that over and over and over again. So I think that the appropriately set up one is the exception, not the rule. But I don't know if you guys have looked at Handshake as an example, but no equity model at all tokens, all decentralized. And that's just a way for people to participate, to help drive this project forward. Will it work? We will see, but there's certainly not an enterprise. I mean, but that's designed to be a self-sustaining, token-driven economy that's fully decentralized. And that's the vision I think people are trying to execute on here.
Yeah, and then they have a great point, because it's the clue is token design, right? And if you don't design it in such a way, but you just use it as a funding tool, where you don't think about the consequences of that. Many of the startups which approached us in 2017, they approached us again this year saying, well, the token didn't work, but now we're raising equity. And that's kind of not the model you want to be part of, right? But if the tokens are designed in a correct way, as you told, then yes, it makes sense. And then you also appreciate value, and it can work for itself within a network.
I would love to have this debate at some point, like in a deeper level, because I think I disagree a little on the right tokenomics design, because I'm not sure that such a thing exists, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. That at some point down the road, when the whole mania is over and the blockchain is adopted in a way, the token doesn't appreciate anymore. There needs to be something else to drive it. Right now, I understand that, but this is just because it's new.
And listen, we gotta have a rematch. Just as an example on the Fluence side, because I know well, the way it works for us is every unit of software you lock up an escrow for what the value is you're using it. So the more software is being used and the more users, the more value is locked on the network. As long as that value grows, you have a very healthy economy. At some point, you reach a system where no one else is using it. maybe, and maybe the token is stable at that point, you know, at a huge value down the road. But people, we think, because open source, still will participate in creating updates as they still do now. And so I guess that there's enough to fund the business for the next couple of years. But as long as you have more services being offered to more users, you have more value being locked on the network, which creates more scarcity, which also creates value increase. But you don't, but even saying that, you don't need to have value increase in perpetuity to have a successfully functioning ecosystem. That's the other thing.
Was this your 1 minute pitch, Tom?
Sure, go ahead.
I haven't even started the pitch.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, I think it's a very point, and the token economics is heavily debated, and I think also we need to understand that it's very young, we're very early, and understanding the valuation and how these crypto economics will work over time. What happens if we're going to see adoption, and what Tom says, also, you know, how these tokens will probably at a certain level sort of stabilize and not have that extremely hard growth rates will be to be seen in the near future, right? And I think understanding how to value them and just over time we'll get definitely a better understanding of seeing these networks grow and the valuation.
Okay, thank you very much for this discussion. Indeed, we are reaching the end of this discussion. We have received a lot of questions from the audience. I apologize to the audience. I cannot share all the questions. We try to answer that later. So some people from the audience helped me. They just commented that the cooperative is an organization which is owned by all the parties, by all the partners. So it's a common shareholding. So in terms of the governance is common. So it's a very democratic organization. That might be the reason why it might be more complicated to take decisions with investors involved. So that was the reason. Yeah. A funny comment on open source. I will read that. We won't comment on that because I just think that the conclusion is interesting. Thanks for this talk. Is open source just for the company benefit or also a social benefit? Wouldn't be a better business model beyond the protectionist policies of hiding the code? So again, we said that open source is not a business model, it's a development model. And the conclusion of that comment is, wouldn't partially open source be comparable with partially vegan food? So it's an interesting comment. So I will let you reflect on that. So what's next? So we're going to conclude this webinar. So we went through the question of the audience. What's next? The next topic will be blockchain for social good, and it will be a talk by Cobox. At 12, we have a startup showroom, and also at 3 p.m. This showroom will be split. So we have 16 startups in blockchain, and that will pitch and demonstrate their case. It will be a one-on-one discussion. So the tool that we are using enables really very good interaction. So if you did not register, so you still have time. You can collect from, there are documents available that you can download. There's a PDF with all the links that you need here. We also have another discussion this afternoon at 2 p.m. about open source. So this time it will be from the developer side. And again, at 4 p.m., we will have more discussion with Maven 11 and more discussion with Signature Ventures. There will be a networking session at 5 p.m. So some people from the audience are asking if you guys could participate to the networking session at 5 p.m. Do you think you can participate?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dominic?
I won't be able, unfortunately, because I have a board meeting.
Okay, but people who want to get in touch with you can participate to the 4 p.m. introduction. Okay, so I'm going to share now the next poll, which is about do you want to receive more information on the topic, how to get in touch with the speakers about BlueMorpho and other topics. So feel free to vote. I will let you a few moments for that. And I would like also to highlight a few companies which are visible during this Impact Week. So yeah, that's people are still voting. There are a huge audience today, and you attracted a lot of interest. So I'm going to close this poll now. So Cobox, Consento, Decentralized Science, iGive2, and MeSensei are the companies which are more dedicated to distributed ledger. You can learn more about this company from our webpage. You can have access to their pitch, to the recording of that pitch. So do you want to meet with these companies? This will be my last question for today. So I will let you answer to this question. And of course, the people who reply yes will be contacted later. And don't forget the networking session at 5 p.m. where you will have the opportunity to meet these companies. Okay, thank you very much for your participation. And gentlemen, it was really a pleasure. You made a great show, a great discussion. So thank you again. I think that the people who participated really enjoyed the discussion. So thank you again and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Cheers.
Bye.